What if I told you that while most of the world is asleep, someone is quietly rewiring their brain, sharpening their focus, and building a version of themselves that the world hasn't even met yet? That someone could be you. Not next year, not someday, but starting tomorrow morning at 5 a.m., winning the first hour of your day is not just about productivity, it's about authority over your own mind. When you wake up at 5 a.m., you are stepping into a moment that most people surrender to sleep, distraction, or delay. In that quiet space, before messages start buzzing and responsibilities begin to pile up, you are given a rare opportunity to choose your direction without interference. This is where intention becomes stronger than impulse. Instead of being pulled into the chaos of the day, you stand still for a moment and decide who you will be. And that simple act, choosing rather than reacting, begins to reshape how your brain operates over time. There is a psychological shift that happens when you consistently win that first hour. Your brain starts to associate mornings with control, not resistance. For most people, mornings are rushed, reactive, and filled with urgency. But when you rise early and use that time deliberately, you create a new pattern. You might read, reflect, exercise, or plan. But more importantly, you are sending a message to your mind: I lead. That message, repeated daily, strengthens neural pathways linked to discipline and focus. It becomes easier to concentrate, easier to act, and harder to fall into distraction because your brain has learned a new standard of operation. The power of this first hour also lies in its simplicity. There are no complex rules, no overwhelming demands, just a commitment to show up. And in that showing up, you begin to build trust with yourself. Every time you get out of bed when it's still dark, every time you resist the urge to snooze, you are proving something silently, that your word matters. That inner trust is one of the most underrated forms of mental strength. When your brain knows that you follow through, it stops questioning your decisions. Doubt fades, hesitation shrinks, and confidence begins to take its place, not as a loud declaration, but as a quiet certainty. Another critical aspect of winning the first hour is the absence of external noise. During the day, your attention is constantly divided. Notifications, conversations, obligations pulling you in different directions. But at 5 a.m., those forces are quiet. This allows your brain to enter a state of deep focus much more easily. In this state, your thinking becomes clearer, your ideas sharper, and your ability to solve problems stronger. It's not just about getting more done, it's about thinking better. Over time, this repeated exposure to focused thinking enhances your cognitive ability, training your mind to go deeper rather than scatter. This early hour also creates a sense of momentum that carries into the rest of your day. When you accomplish something meaningful before most people have even woken up, your brain registers that as a win. And wins, no matter how small, have a compounding effect. They release motivation, build energy, and create a forward driving force. Instead of starting your day behind, you begin ahead. That psychological advantage changes how you approach challenges. You're no longer trying to catch up, you're building on progress. And that shift in perspective makes you more resilient, more proactive, and more willing to take on difficult tasks. Finally, winning the first hour is about identity. It's about becoming someone who doesn't leave their life to chance. Each morning at 5 a.m., you cast a vote for the person you are becoming. You are no longer defined by comfort or convenience, but by intention and action. Your brain adapts to this identity, reinforcing behaviors that align with it. Over time, this creates a powerful loop. Your actions shape your identity, and your identity shapes your actions. And it all begins with that first hour, quiet, unseen, but profoundly transformative. Neuroplasticity is one of the most powerful truths about the human brain, yet most people live as if their habits, intelligence, and focus are fixed. The reality is far more empowering. Your brain is not a static machine. It is a living, adapting system that reshapes itself based on what you repeatedly do. When you engage in a 5 a.m. habit, You are not just changing your schedule. You are actively participating in the rewiring of your mind. Each morning becomes a signal to your brain about what kind of person you are becoming, and over time, those signals turn into structure. At the core of neuroplasticity is the idea that neurons that fire together wire together. This means every repeated behavior strengthens a pathway in your brain, making that behavior easier to repeat in the future. When you consistently wake up early, resist comfort, and engage in focused activity, your brain begins to treat discipline as the default setting. What once required effort slowly becomes automatic. You are no longer forcing yourself to act with discipline. You are becoming someone whose brain naturally leans toward it. That is not motivation. That is biological transformation. The early morning hours are especially powerful for this process because your mind is still in a highly receptive state. After sleep, the brain is flexible, less cluttered by sensory input, and more capable of forming new patterns. This is why what you do at 5 a.m. matters more than what you do at almost any other time of day. If you fill that space with distraction, your brain learns distraction. But if you fill it with focus, reading, planning, reflection, learning, you are literally programming your mind for clarity. Over weeks and months, this repetition builds a cognitive identity that is sharper, calmer, and more structured. What makes neuroplasticity so transformative is that it does not discriminate between positive and negative habits. The brain adapts equally to both. This means every time you choose discipline over delay, you are strengthening one neural pathway. And every time you choose comfort over commitment, you are strengthening another. The 5 a.m. habit tilts that balance in your favor. It reduces the space for unconscious reactive behavior and replaces it with deliberate action. Slowly, your default responses begin to shift. You stop asking, "Do I feel like it?" and start operating from, "This is what I do." As these patterns deepen, something subtle but profound begins to happen in your thinking. Your mind becomes less scattered. Tasks that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. Your attention span increases because your brain has been trained to sustain focus in quiet, uninterrupted environments. You are not just waking up early. You are training your cognitive system to handle complexity with greater ease. This is how neuroplasticity translates into real-world advantage, clearer thinking, better decisions, and improved emotional control under pressure. Over time, the most important shift is not in what you do, but in how you see yourself. Your brain begins to build an identity based on repetition. When you consistently act with discipline in the early hours of the day, your mind stops seeing it as an effort and starts recognizing it as identity. You are no longer someone trying to be productive. You are someone who is productive. This identity shift is the deepest layer of neuroplastic change. It is where behavior stops feeling external and starts feeling natural, as if it has always belonged to you. Silence at 5 a.m. is not just the absence of sound. It is the presence of something far more powerful, mental clarity. In a world that constantly competes for your attention, silence becomes a rare environment where your mind is no longer being pulled in 10 different directions at once. There are no notifications demanding a response, no conversations shaping your reactions, no external pressures influencing your thoughts. In that stillness, you are left alone with your mind in its raw form. And that is where true mental strength begins to develop, not in noise, but in quiet confrontation with yourself. At first, that silence can feel uncomfortable. When most people are used to constant stimulation, sitting in stillness forces them to face thoughts they normally avoid. Doubts, fears, unfinished goals, and internal questions tend to surface. But this is exactly where growth begins. Instead of escaping into distraction, the 5 a.m. habit teaches you to remain present. You begin to observe your thoughts instead of reacting to them. Over time, this builds emotional resilience. You stop being controlled by every passing feeling or impulse and instead develop the ability to sit with discomfort without being consumed by it. This mental discipline creates a new kind of strength, one that is not loud or aggressive, but steady and controlled. When you consistently engage with silence, your brain learns how to process thoughts more deeply rather than reacting instantly. You become less impulsive and more reflective. Instead of rushing into decisions or emotional responses, you start pausing, analyzing, and choosing your actions with intention. This shift is subtle at first, but over time it transforms how you handle pressure, conflict, and uncertainty in everyday life. Silence also strengthens your ability to focus in a way that modern environments rarely allow. In a quiet morning setting, your attention is not fragmented. You can direct your mind toward one task, one idea, or one goal without interruption. This deep focus trains your brain to resist distraction even when noise returns later in the day. You begin to notice that your mind does not scatter as easily. You can stay with a thought longer, work through complex ideas more effectively, and complete tasks with greater efficiency. The silence of 5 a.m. becomes a training ground for mental endurance. Another powerful effect of embracing silence is the development of self-awareness. Without external input, your internal voice becomes louder. You start to notice how you think. Not just awareness is critical, because most people live on autopilot, reacting without understanding their own mental patterns. But in silence, you begin to recognize habits of thought, negative loops, limiting beliefs, or unproductive mental patterns. Once you can see them clearly, you gain the ability to change them. And that awareness is the first step toward real mental control. Eventually, this daily practice of silence reshapes your relationship with yourself. You are no longer afraid of your own thoughts because you have learned how to sit with them, understand them, and move through them. The mind becomes less chaotic and more organized. Instead of being a place of confusion, it becomes a space of clarity and direction. And as this internal strength grows, it begins to influence everything else. Your decisions, your confidence, and the way you respond to the world around you. Momentum is one of the most misunderstood forces in personal development. People often wait for motivation to appear before they act, but motivation is inconsistent. It rises and falls with mood, environment, and energy. The 5 a.m. habit changes this entirely by teaching your brain to generate momentum before the world even has a chance to influence you. When you wake up early and take action immediately, you are no longer dependent on feeling ready. You are creating readiness through movement. That shift is subtle, but it transforms how your entire day unfolds. At 5 a.m., there is a unique psychological advantage, the absence of resistance from the outside world. No emails demanding attention, no social expectations, no urgent interruptions. In that space, even small actions carry more weight. Making your bed, reading a few pages, writing your goals, these are not just tasks, they are signals. They tell your brain that the day has already started with purpose. Each completed action builds internal momentum, like pushing a wheel that becomes easier to turn the more it moves. The key is that you start the wheel yourself rather than waiting for external forces to push it for you. As this pattern continues, your brain begins to associate early action with identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who needs motivation and start recognizing yourself as someone who acts regardless of it. This is where a powerful internal shift takes place. The phrase, "I don't feel like it," begins to lose influence over your decisions. Instead, your mind starts defaulting to action because it has been trained repeatedly that action comes first. That automatic response is what separates those who stay stuck from those who continuously move forward. Momentum also creates a psychological spillover effect throughout the day. When you start strong, your brain carries that sense of progress into later tasks. Challenges that would normally feel heavy become easier to approach because you are already in motion. You are not starting from zero. You are building from an active state. This reduces hesitation and increases efficiency. Instead of overthinking tasks, you begin to approach them with a sense of flow, as if your mind has already been primed to keep moving forward. There is also an emotional dimension to momentum that often goes unnoticed. Early wins in the morning generate a quiet confidence that influences how you interact with everything that follows. You are less likely to feel overwhelmed because your brain has already registered success. That feeling becomes a reference point. No matter what challenges appear later in the day, your mind can recall, I already started strong, I am already ahead. That internal reassurance reduces stress and increases resilience under pressure. Over time, this self-generated momentum becomes part of your identity system. You no longer wait for conditions to be perfect before you act. You create conditions through action. The 5 a.m. habit trains your brain to initiate movement without hesitation, and that ability compounds daily. What begins as a simple morning routine evolves into a mindset where progress is constant, not occasional. And in that shift, you stop relying on external motivation entirely. You become the source of your own momentum. Decision fatigue is one of the silent forces that drains human performance every single day, yet most people never recognize it. From the moment you wake up, your brain begins spending energy on choices: what to do, when to do it, how to respond, what to avoid. Each decision, no matter how small, uses mental fuel. By the end of the day, that fuel is depleted and your ability to make strong, disciplined choices weakens. The 5 a.m. habit disrupts this cycle by removing one of the most important decisions altogether: whether or not you will start your day with discipline. That decision is already made before the world wakes up. When you consistently wake up at 5 a.m., you eliminate negotiation from your morning routine. There is no internal debate about whether you should get up, whether you feel ready, or whether you can afford to delay. You simply act. And that consistency creates a powerful effect in your brain. Instead of repeatedly spending energy on the same choice every morning, your mind begins to automate it. What once required effort becomes instinct. This conservation of mental energy allows your brain to redirect its focus toward more meaningful tasks throughout the day. As decision fatigue decreases, something interesting begins to happen: clarity increases. When your mind is not constantly cluttered with minor choices and internal negotiations, it becomes sharper and more focused. You can think more deeply about important matters because your cognitive resources are no longer scattered. You start approaching your day with a sense of structure rather than chaos. Tasks that once felt overwhelming become easier to organize because your mental space is no longer occupied by unnecessary decision-making loops. This reduction in mental overload also strengthens discipline in other areas of life. When your brain learns that one key decision is non-negotiable, waking up early, it begins to extend that pattern into other behaviors. You start making quicker, more confident decisions throughout the day. There is less hesitation because your mind has been trained to act without overthinking. Instead of getting stuck in cycles of doubt, you begin to trust your first instinct more often, and that trust accelerates your ability to move through tasks efficiently. Another important effect of reducing decision fatigue is emotional stability. When your mind is constantly making small, draining choices, it becomes more reactive and less patient. But when that burden is lifted through structured habits like the 5 a.m. routine, emotional energy is preserved. You are less likely to feel irritated, overwhelmed, or mentally scattered. Instead, you operate from a calmer internal state, which allows you to respond rather than react. That emotional balance becomes a quiet advantage in both personal and professional situations. Over time, this habit reshapes how your brain allocates energy. Instead of wasting mental resources on repetitive decisions, your mind learns to prioritize execution. You stop overthinking basic actions and begin directing your focus toward growth, creativity, and problem solving. The 5 a.m. habit becomes a system of simplification, removing unnecessary friction so that your mental energy is reserved for what truly matters. And in that simplicity, your effectiveness increases without additional effort, because your mind is no longer burdened by constant decision overload. Identity is the deepest layer of transformation, and it is where the 5 a.m. habit becomes something far greater than a routine. Most people try to change their lives by focusing on actions first: what to do, what to stop, what to improve. But actions alone are unstable if they are not rooted in identity. When you wake up at 5 a.m. consistently, something subtle begins to shift in how you see yourself. You are no longer someone who is trying to be disciplined. You are someone who already is disciplined. That internal definition changes everything. At first, the habit feels external. You set the alarm, you force yourself out of bed, and you rely on willpower. But repetition changes the relationship between effort and identity. The brain is always observing patterns, and when it sees you repeatedly choosing discipline over comfort, it begins to update its self-image. This is not a conscious decision. It is neurological adaptation. Your mind starts building a narrative. This is who I am. And once that narrative forms, it begins to guide your behavior automatically. What makes identity powerful is that it removes constant internal negotiation. Instead of asking, should I wake up early today? Your mind stops asking altogether. The decision becomes part of your character, not your debate. And when behavior becomes identity-based, it no longer requires motivation. You don't act because you feel like it. You act because it aligns with who you believe you are. This shift reduces resistance and increases consistency because you are no longer fighting yourself every morning. As this identity strengthens, your standards naturally rise. You begin to expect more from yourself without external pressure. Small compromises that once felt acceptable start to feel out of alignment. You become more aware of how your actions either support or contradict the person you are becoming. This awareness creates a natural filter for behavior. You begin to choose differently, not out of force, but out of alignment. And that alignment creates stability in your habits, your focus, and your decisions. Another powerful effect of identity-based change is confidence, not the loud, temporary kind, but the quiet confidence that comes from self-trust. When you consistently follow through on something as demanding as waking up at 5 a.m., your brain stores evidence that you are reliable to yourself. That evidence builds internal certainty. You stop doubting your ability to follow through because your history proves otherwise. And that self-trust becomes the foundation for tackling larger challenges in life without hesitation. Eventually, the habit becomes invisible. You no longer think of yourself as someone who wakes up early. You simply do it. It is no longer an action you perform, but a reflection of who you are. That is the final stage of transformation, when discipline is no longer something you practice, but something you embody. At that point, the 5 a.m. habit is no longer the goal. It is simply the natural expression of an identity that has been rebuilt through repetition, awareness, and consistency. And when all of this comes together, discipline, clarity, momentum, and identity, you realize something important. The 5 a.m. hour was never the real secret. The real shift was what it forced you to become. It stripped away distraction until only intention remained. It replaced hesitation with action and noise with awareness. It trained your mind to stop waiting for permission and start creating direction. Not once, but repeatedly, until your thoughts, choices, and behavior began to move in the same direction without conflict. Because in the end, success is not built in loud moments of inspiration. It is built in quiet repetition. When no one is watching, and when it would be easier to stay in bed, that is where the mind is shaped. That is where identity is formed. And that is where the future is decided long before the world ever sees it.